Little did he know that he had chosen Bruce Lee. He looked around the room and pointed at the smallest man he could find. That was the calculation. Not talent. Not instinct. Just optics. A champion needs a contrast, something that makes the gap between ordinary and extraordinary visible. And in the crowded Long Beach Municipal Auditorium in August 1967, the man standing on that demonstration stage thought he had found exactly what he was looking for. A small, unremarkable figure sitting quietly in the crowd. Dark clothes, no uniform, no belt, nothing to indicate that he had ever trained a day in his life. Perfect. Victor Moore was a world karate champion many times over. He had defeated Joe Louis, Mike Stone, and Bill Superfoot Wallace, names that still mean something to anyone who knows the history of American martial arts. He was a dominant, decorated, technically precise fighter who had earned every piece of his reputation through years of hard competition. And now he wanted to show the audience what speed looked like when it was real. So he pointed. He had no idea who he was pointing at. The man in the crowd stood up, nodded simply, and walked toward the platform. He moved without urgency, without announcement, without any of the body language that fighters adopt when they want the room to know they're fighters. He looked like someone who had come to watch. He looked like a guest. His name was Bruce Lee. And in a matter of seconds, Victor Moore's understanding of speed, timing, and what a human body was capable of would be rearranged entirely. This is the story of how that happened, why it happened, and what it meant for every martial art practiced in the world today. The man before the legend before there was a legend, there was a boy in Hong Kong who kept getting into fights he wasn't supposed to win. Bruce Lee was born on November 27, 1940, in San Francisco's Chinatown, born, appropriately enough, in both the hour and the year of the dragon, according to the Chinese zodiac. His father, Li Huichen, was a well-known Cantonese opera singer touring the United States at the time. The family returned to Hong Kong soon after Bruce's birth, and it was there, in the narrow, electric streets of one of the world's most densely populated cities, that he grew up. Hong Kong in the 1940s and 1950s was not a gentle place for a young man with a restless mind and too much energy. The city was a pressure cooker of cultures, old money and new hustle, tradition and modernity grinding against each other on every corner. Bruce grew up in a neighborhood where street gangs were a daily reality, and he was, by his own admission, not the kind of person who walked away from confrontation. He got into fights. He lost some. He started looking for a way to stop losing them. He was 13 years old when someone pointed him toward a martial arts school where a master named IP Man was teaching an ancient southern Chinese fighting system called Wing Chun. IP Man was already a legend in certain circles, a quiet, precise, extraordinarily skilled practitioner who had fled mainland China when the communists came to power and had set up in Hong Kong to teach. He accepted Bruce as a student, and what followed was one of the most consequential student-teacher relationships in martial arts history. Wing Chun is not a dramatic martial art. There are no flying kicks, no acrobatic spins, no tiger claws or crane stances. It is a system built on economy. The centerline theory that runs through Wing Chun holds that the most efficient path between two fighters is a straight line down the middle, and that controlling that line gives structural advantages that have nothing to do with strength or size. Short, direct punches. Close-range sensitivity. A training exercise called Chi Saw, sticky hands, where two practitioners pressed their forearms together and tried to find openings through touch rather than sight. It was practical, efficient, unglamorous, and devastatingly effective in close quarters. Bruce Lee trained under IP Man from around 1954 until 1959, when family circumstances led him back across the Pacific. He was 18 years old. He had been born in the United States, which meant he held American citizenship. And so he boarded a ship and sailed back to San Francisco, carrying about $100, a handful of clothes, and 6 years of Wing Chun embedded so deeply in his muscle memory it had become part of how he thought. He arrived in a country that did not know him and did not particularly care to. America and the Invisible Man in 1959, Asian martial arts were not something mainstream America thought about much. Karate had been imported by soldiers returning from Japan and Okinawa after the Second World War, and it was slowly spreading through gyms and dojos across the country. But Chinese martial arts, Kung Fu, was something else entirely. It existed in Chinatown movie theaters and in the imaginations of people who had seen Hong Kong films, but as a serious practice, as something with genuine fighting application, the American martial arts establishment largely dismissed it. Too decorative. Too theatrical. Nice to look at, useless in a real confrontation. Bruce Lee, 20 years old, living in Seattle, washing dishes at a Chinese restaurant, enrolling at the University of Washington to study drama, did not agree. And he had a way of making people understand his disagreement that went beyond words. He began teaching out of his home, then in a small school he opened in Seattle, then in a second school he founded in Oakland after dropping out of university in 1964 and moving to live with James Yim Lee, a well-known Chinese martial artist 20 years his senior. James Lee had been building a progressive, forward-thinking martial arts community in the Bay Area for years, and he introduced Bruce to Ed Parker, a Hawaiian-born Kenpo master who was among the first people to understand that the entire American martial arts scene was about to be changed by this young man from Hong Kong. Parker was organizing events, building bridges, connecting people. He had seen Bruce demonstrate, and what he saw had kept him awake for several nights afterward. Because Bruce Lee was doing something that the American karate community had no language for. He was eliminating the telegraph. Every technique in martial arts, every kick, every punch, every strike, requires some form of preparation. A shift of weight. A tensing of muscles. A slight rotation of the hip. These preparations happen in fractions of a second, but they happen, and a trained fighter can read them. They are the sentence before the word, the breath before the shout. You learn to anticipate attacks not by waiting for them but by reading the signals that precede them. What Bruce Lee was developing, a system he was beginning to call Jun Fan Gung Fu, and which would eventually become Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, eliminated those signals. His strikes began in arrival. There was no visible preparation. He was in a neutral position, and then his fist was somewhere it had not been a fraction of a second before, and your brain had not registered the transition. He was not faster in the way that a sprinter is faster than a jogger. He was fast in a completely different dimension. He had removed the starting gun. At his peak, standing 5 feet 8 inches and weighing around 130 to 140 pounds, Bruce Lee carried an estimated 5 to 6% body fat, lower than most elite athletes today. He trained in ways that were decades ahead of what his contemporaries were doing. He lifted weights when most martial artists considered physical conditioning either unnecessary or incompatible with their practice. He aimed for 500 punches a day, some while holding light weights. He ran, he cycled, he kept meticulous training journals recording every set, every repetition, every variation in his routine. His forearms were disproportionately developed because he trained his grip constantly, understanding that power transmission requires control at the point of contact. He was, in every measurable dimension, a machine that had been engineered with extraordinary precision for a single purpose. And then, in late 1964, something happened that made him dismantle everything he thought he knew and start over. The fight that broke everything open. He had been making a name for himself in Oakland's martial arts community. He had been vocal, perhaps too vocal by some accounts, about the limitations of traditional styles. He had given demonstrations in San Francisco's Chinatown. He had spoken about modernizing martial arts and opening it to everyone regardless of race, a radical position in the early 1960s. When Chinese martial arts schools routinely refused to teach non-Chinese students, guarding their systems like state secrets. The traditional community did not appreciate being told their secrets were of limited value. And so a challenge came. A young fighter named Wang Jackman, trained in Xingyiquan, Northern Shaolin, and Tai Chi, and a skilled and serious practitioner in his own right, was sent to settle the question. The arrangement, according to most accounts, was stark. If Bruce Lee lost, he would close his school and stop teaching non-Chinese students. The fight happened privately in Bruce's Oakland school on Broadway Avenue, in front of just a handful of witnesses. Accounts of what actually occurred have been disputed for over 6 decades. Linda Lee, Bruce's wife, said it was over in about 3 minutes with Bruce dominant from start to finish. Wang Jackman's later account described something longer and more complicated, lasting perhaps 20 minutes, with a different character entirely. Some witnesses sided with one version, some with the other. What everyone agrees on, including Bruce Lee himself, speaking without naming Wang, is that the fight left him deeply dissatisfied. Not with the outcome. With himself. With his own system. He had won, he believed, but it had taken too long and cost too much energy. Wing Chun, even his modified version, had exposed gaps he had not known were there. He had felt winded. He had chased his opponent rather than intercepting him, which violated everything he believed about efficient combat. He spent the following months in a fury of reconsideration. He dismantled everything. He started reading books on physics, biomechanics, and the science of human movement. He studied boxing, fencing, wrestling. He incorporated elements from every discipline that offered something real and discarded the rest without ceremony. He started lifting weights when most martial artists considered it antithetical to their practice. What emerged from this period was the beginning of Jeet Kune Do, not a style, not a system in the traditional sense, but a philosophy of combat. Use what works. Discard what doesn't. Add what is uniquely your own. Be formless, like water, taking the shape of whatever container you're poured into. He was 24 years old, and he was building something that would take the rest of the world another 30 years to catch up to. Long Beach, 1964, the first time the room went silent before the 1967 encounter with Victor Moore. There was a moment in 1964 that set the stage for everything. Ed Parker had organized the inaugural Long Beach International Karate Championships, and he had invited Bruce Lee to demonstrate. The event was held at the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium in August 1964 and drew practitioners from across the country. Chuck Norris was there, working as a judge. The audience was sophisticated, knowledgeable, the kind of crowd that would know immediately if what they were watching was real or theatrical. Bruce Lee stood before them and showed them 2 things that left permanent marks. The first was 2-finger push-ups. Not on his palms. On the thumb and index finger of one hand, feet shoulder-width apart. The room watched a 130-pound man perform a feat of strength that most dedicated athletes could not approach. It was not gymnastics. It was not a trick. It was the product of obsessive, systematic physical training applied with surgical precision to a specific goal. The second was the 1-inch punch. He placed his right fist 1 inch, about 2.5 centimeters, from a volunteer's chest. No room to swing. No room to load momentum. No room for anything the physics of striking, as most people understood it, would allow. He then delivered the punch without retracting his arm. The volunteer's name was Bob Baker, from Stockton, California. He flew backward off his feet and into a chair that had been placed behind him to prevent injury. Baker later said he had to stay home from work for days afterward because the pain in his chest was too severe. He asked Bruce never to demonstrate on him again. The room erupted. In the crowd, a celebrity hairstylist named Jay Sebring was so astonished by what he had witnessed that he told every person in Hollywood he could reach about this young man from Hong Kong. One of those conversations reached a television producer named William Dozier, who was coming off the massive success of Batman and was developing a new project. Dozier got hold of footage from the tournament, summoned Bruce Lee for a screen test, and the result, 2 years later, was The Green Hornet, the first American television series to show Asian-style martial arts to a mainstream Western audience. It ran for one season from 1966 to 1967, and in Hong Kong, where audiences were far more interested in the sidekick than the superhero, it became known as the Kato Show. But all of that comes later. In 1964, Bruce Lee drove home from Long Beach, having left a crater in the American martial arts community that was still smoking 3 years later, when he drove back for the 1967 championships. Victor Moore. The champion this story deserves. Before we arrive at the main event, it is essential to properly establish who Victor Moore actually was. The popular telling of this story tends to flatten him into a convenient foil, the arrogant champion who didn't know what he was getting into. That is a disservice to one of the most accomplished martial artists American karate has ever produced. Victor Moore was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1943. He began his physical training at 7 years old, lifting heavy buckets filled with coal, reading Charles Atlas books cover to cover, absorbing judo, jiu-jitsu, and eventually karate through a network of instructors and schools that included some of the most significant figures in early American martial arts. He earned a black belt in Kenpo-style karate by the time he was 17. He went on to study Goju-ryu, Shotokan, Chido-ryu, Bando, stick fighting, and Thai boxing. He was mentored by Robert A. Trias, widely considered the father of American karate. He also had 12 amateur boxing fights and won every single one of them. Victor Moore was a 4-time world champion who competed seriously from 1965 through 1975 and placed in every tournament he entered throughout that decade. Every single one. His competitive record included defeating Joe Louis, Mike Stone, and Bill Superfoot Wallace, names that sit at the very top of American karate history. He was one of the first African Americans to win a major national karate competition, taking the 1965 USCA Grand Nationals at a time when the martial arts establishment, like most of American society, was not always welcoming of black champions. He and Joe Louis later co-introduced kickboxing to American national television on The Merv Griffin Show in 1969. Victor Moore was not a prop. He was one of the greatest competitive karate fighters America has ever produced, and the moment in 1967 at Long Beach did not diminish that. It added a chapter to it. When Moore stepped forward at the 1967 championships, he was responding to a public challenge Bruce Lee had issued to national champions, a speed drill to determine whether Lee's famous punch could be stopped. Moore was among the skeptics. He later said that nobody in the room had much respect for Bruce Lee as a fighter at that point. He was seen as a movie actor, a television personality, someone who had built a public image but whose actual fighting ability had not been tested against serious competition. Moore stepped up partly because someone needed to, and partly because he genuinely believed he could block the punch. He was documented as one of the fastest blockers in American karate. That was not an opinion. That was a competitive, verifiable fact. It did not matter. The demonstration that rewrote the rules, the setup, was deliberately simple. Bruce Lee told Moore exactly what was coming. He was going to throw a straight punch to the face. Moore's only job was to block it. Lee stepped back several paces. He asked if Moore was ready. Moore nodded. Lee glided forward, closing the distance with footwork that was not a rush but something fluid and controlled, like water finding a path. And then he threw the punch. Moore did not block it. Lee stopped it just short of contact. The crowd registered what had happened before Moore did. They tried again. And again. Most accounts, including from eyewitnesses like Chuck Norris's contemporaries and Bill Superfoot Wallace, who was present, cite multiple attempts where Moore could not get his hands up in time. In footage that still exists today, filmed at higher quality than almost anything else from Bruce Lee's pre-filmed career, the strikes can be seen reaching Moore's face before his defensive response completes the journey. What Bruce Lee was doing was not technically throwing a faster punch than Moore could block. The physics do not work out quite that simply at the margins they were operating in. What he was doing was something more interesting and more difficult. He was eliminating the time between intention and execution. The non-telegraphic punch, the concept he had first explained publicly at the 1964 Long Beach event, the same concept Taekwondo master Jun Rhee credited entirely to Bruce Lee and incorporated into American Taekwondo, does not begin with a preparation that an opponent can read. It does not create a window. Human reaction time, at its absolute best, operates somewhere around 0.1 to 0.15 seconds. Independent estimates from the era suggest some of Bruce Lee's punches, delivered from a short distance, traveled in approximately 0.05 seconds from initiation to full extension. He was consistently operating inside the margin that human neurology requires to recognize and respond to an incoming attack. It was not magic. It was physics, specifically the physics of removing all unnecessary motion from the chain of events between decision and delivery. Moore was not slow. Moore was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinarily fast. The problem was that he was fast within a system that still had a starting gun. Bruce Lee had removed the starting gun. There is a particular quality to a crowd that has just seen something it cannot explain, a stillness, and then a noise that is not quite applause, not quite disbelief, but something between them. The footage captures it. You can see the moment the room understands that what it has just witnessed cannot be accounted for by the framework it brought to the building. The controversy and the truth of it would be dishonest to present this as a clean, uncontested event with no complications, and dishonest is not what this channel does. Victor Moore has maintained consistently, across decades of interviews, that the account that entered martial arts history was incomplete at best and distorted at worst. His version includes block strikes early in the demonstration, a punch directed at a different target than what had been agreed upon, and footage that was selectively repeated to construct a narrative favoring Bruce Lee's image. He also claims he landed counter-strikes on Lee, a claim that other eyewitnesses, including Bill Wallace and Chuck Sullivan, have categorically denied. Moore is not a man without credibility. His competitive record speaks for itself. His contributions to American karate, as a competitor, as a teacher, as a barrier breaker for black martial artists in a field that was not always welcoming, are real and documented and significant. He deserves better than to be flattened into a punchline in somebody else's story. What seems most accurate, reading across the sources available, Wikipedia, eyewitness interviews, the Whistlekick Martial Arts radio episode where Moore spoke at length, accounts from practitioners who were present, is something like this. Bruce Lee threw multiple strikes that Moore could not successfully block. Whether the exact number was 3 or 8, whether some early strikes to the body were defended, whether any counter-strikes landed, these details are genuinely contested and may never be fully resolved. What is not contested is the central phenomenon. A man nobody in that room had prepared for did something with speed and timing that the most accomplished fighters in American karate could not reliably counter in a controlled drilling situation. That is the fact underneath the legend. The legend grew from the fact, and like all legends, it simplified and amplified. The fact is already remarkable enough. What he left in that room, and in all of us, every person who competes in mixed martial arts today, whether they know it or not, is practicing something that Bruce Lee sketched in rough outline in the early 1960s. The idea that a fighter should draw from multiple disciplines rather than committing exclusively to one. The idea that forms and katas and rigid traditional patterns have limited value against an opponent who doesn't follow the same rules. The idea that physical conditioning is inseparable from fighting ability. The idea that speed is not merely a natural gift, but a trainable skill governed by measurable principles. In 2004, Dana White, founder of the UFC, called Bruce Lee the father of mixed martial arts. That is not a hyperbolic marketing claim. It is a description of intellectual causality. Someone looked at a landscape of separate, insular fighting traditions and said, "What if we kept the useful parts of all of them, and stopped pretending that any single system had all the answers?" Bruce Lee said that in 1960. The UFC was founded in 1993. It took American combat sports 3 decades to institutionalize what one man was already doing in a small school in Oakland. His students carried what he built into the world after his death in July 1973, when he died at 32, just weeks before Enter the Dragon's American release made him a global superstar. Dan Inosanto, who had been at the 1964 Long Beach event, who had been in the crowd at the 1967 event and watched the demonstration, became one of the most respected martial arts teachers on earth. Taiki Kimura continued teaching in Seattle. Ted Wong preserved the technical specifics of what Lee had developed. The Jeet Kune Do community continues to evolve along 2 broad lines. Those who teach what Bruce taught as closely as possible, and those who take his foundational principle, absorb what is useful, discard what is not, and keep adapting. Both are honoring him. Both are right. His films changed cinema. The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon, Enter the Dragon, these did not just entertain. They changed the visual grammar of action on screen. Fight choreography as a communicative art form, as storytelling, as character expression, this existed in Hong Kong before Bruce Lee but had no real presence in Western film. He carried it there. Every action film made in the last 50 years involving martial arts choreography owes something to what he demonstrated was possible. He also changed who got to be a hero on screen. At a time when Asian actors in American film were restricted almost entirely to supporting roles, to stereotypes, to comic relief or villainy, Bruce Lee walked into frame as the most dangerous man in the room and did not apologize for it. He refused roles that would have diminished him. He walked off sets when scripts asked him to fight in ways he knew were dishonest. He held his ground, and when Hollywood would not open its doors, he went through the wall instead. And Victor Moore, the man who pointed, the man who stood on that platform and faced something he could not account for, kept going. He went on competing and winning. He opened schools in Ohio and North Carolina that trained generations of fighters. He told his version of events for decades, insisted on complexity and nuance in a story the world preferred simple. His legacy in American karate stands entirely on its own, independent of one afternoon in Long Beach in 1967. The man who was pointed at walked to the platform the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance without announcing it. He demonstrated with the detached precision of someone showing you something that simply is, the way you would demonstrate that water flows downhill. Here is the principle. Here is its application. You can work out the implications. He was 30 years old. He had 2 years left to live. He had already changed everything. Be like water, he said. Water does not fight the shape of its container. It accepts the container, fills it completely, and then finds a way through. He found a way through everywhere he went. Even into a crowded auditorium in Long Beach, where a champion looked around the room, decided the smallest man in the 3rd row would make a good prop, and pointed. He had no idea. Now the whole world does. If this story connected with you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find what we're building here. And if you want to be in the room the next time we find a moment that changed everything, subscribe and bring someone who has never heard this story. There are more rooms like this one. More moments where someone pointed at the wrong person. And we are going to find every single one. See you in the next one.